Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Hormonally Speaking. Today we're going to get into some good nitty gritty about things that we may not know quite as much about when it comes to our cycle and how that impacts our intimacy and our desire and, just the process of moving through life and having those shifting changes when it comes to our desire. I feel like we are not talking about that enough. I do know some women that kind of get to the point, in perimenopause where they're just like, I don't even care anymore. And the thing is, it doesn't have to be that way, right? There's so much going on that once we understand what's happening, we can really connect to our bodies in a different way. So I'm super excited to have this conversation today with my guest, Jordan Donnell, who's a physician assistant and women's health, sexual health educator and intimacy coach and speaker. She's the founder and host of the Vaginas, Vulvas, and Vibrators podcast, where conversations about sex, sexuality, sexual intimacy, and relationships happen. She wants to help women feel informed about their pleasure while also create a safe space for women to feel validated. She has been featured in Cosmopolitan Magazine, Women's Health Magazine, and many other podcasts. Welcome, Jordan.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm super excited to chat with you about this conversation today because it's not something I feel like we've covered enough on the podcast. Certainly we've talked about sex, but really I think the information and the understanding of the different hormones and how they're connected to our desire is, not out there in an easy way for a lot of the listeners to understand. So why don't we start at the beginning for those that don't really know about the hormonal fluctuations that happen during a cycle? Can you break that down for us?
Yes, so we will start with explaining the menstrual cycle. And there are four main phases of the menstrual cycle, which I'm sure you've got lots of resources for this too. But you have your follicular phase, ovulation, luteal, and then menses or the bleeding part of your menstrual cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And during the follicular phase, your estrogen is rising. That is being produced by a follicle that has an egg in it that is going to be released at ovulation. At ovulation, your LH or your luteinizing hormone peaks, which causes ovulation and the final maturing of the egg. But also, testosterone is at its highest at this point, which is going to be something that's really important that we will kind of circle back to as
Mm-hmm.
well
Mm-hmm.
in this conversation. After the egg is released, then you move into your luteal phase, which is when progesterone is at its highest. Estrogen has like a second peak here as well, but progesterone is the predominant hormone in the luteal phase.
Mm-hmm.
And then without fertilization, the egg the lining sheds, and then the progesterone drops, and that causes the menstrual cycle to start. So, right before your menses is when your hormones are at the absolute lowest.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like the briefest overview we can do of the menstrual cycle.
Yeah. Well, I think that was great. And I love I think one of the parts that a lot of people don't understand is that drop in hormones that happens and that actually kicks off your period. And the thing that I think is so cool about the menstrual cycle, so I always have to like geek out on it a little bit, it's really this orchestra that's happening, right? Like and you have to sort of, there's always some hormone going on. So even when your progesterone and your estrogen drop, it's 2 days before your period kicks off, your FSH is starting to slowly rise, right? It's prepping for your next cycle. So there's never it's not a start point and an end point. They're constantly overlapping and kind of preparing and building for the next time. And I just think it's such a cool thing. And I wish that we had learned about it. Most of us did not learn about it as a child. And how incredible and amazing it is that our bodies go through this whole process every month without us even thinking about it. We don't really think about it
Yeah.
until symptoms arise. But it's just such a beautiful combination of things happening and, a talk between your brain and your ovaries in this communication system. And so you can really see how much things like stress out in our lives can impact our hormones and that hormonal cascade because of that, signal coming in via our brain and then talking to our
Yeah.
ovaries. Yeah.
It's so fascinating how much is happening that we don't know about
Yeah.
inside of us, and it's just doing its thing, and it impacts every day of our lives as menstruating women,
Mhm.
and we just don't even realize that it's happening in the background.
Right.
You brought up when the hormones are the lowest.
Hmm.
I want to also point out that when you are taking birth control or doing progesterone withdrawals, it's mimicking that same hormone drop when you stop the hormones.
Hmm.
And that's what's causing the same bleed, which is a withdrawal bleed, not a true menstrual bleed.
Yes. Yes. So important. I feel like I have to talk about that again and again because I didn't even know that until a few years ago, right? Majority
Yep.
of us are never taught that that's not a true period when you're on birth control. That is what we call that withdrawal bleed because you didn't ovulate, so it's not a true period, and so that's such an important thing for us to understand that that ovulation part of our cycle is such a it's kind of the big show, right? Even though we kind of think about our periods being that. Going back to the stress piece, I think that this is such an important part when we are talking about desire, right? Because in feeling stress in our lives, dealing with that outside stress, that impacting coming through our brain and our brain talking to our ovaries, I think a lot of women don't understand that that's directly how stress impacts not only ovulation, but our sex drive too, right? So do you want to talk a little
Yes.
bit about that?
Well, yeah, and it even impacts your adrenals.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that has a role in all of your hormones as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so, stress, a couple of things. When you're feeling stressed out, you're probably not feeling very sexy. And
Mm-hmm.
so, that also has an impact on your desire there too. So, I think that stress plays a role in a lot of different ways in reducing desire,
Mm-hmm.
and that you've got a lot of other things going on. So it's really not at the forefront. When it comes to sex and desire, it's not something that is necessary for biological living. And so when you're stressed, yeah, that's going to be one of the first things to go away because you don't need it to sustain life.
Right.
And so stress has a huge impact on your desire, and all of that.
Yeah. And, I think it's a good thing to think about the difference between, the, if you want to say biological male body and biological female body in terms of because of these hormones and how desire can be so different, And so let's talk a little bit about testosterone because we know most of us know testosterone is kind of the hormone of desire. And obviously, in a male biological body, it's going to be pretty steady. Of course, it declines with age, but on a like if we're looking like a monthly basis, their testosterone is going to be pretty steady. So stress may not impact them in the same way that it does us,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Yeah, go
Well,
ahead.
and with testosterone, so you brought this up, it's highest with ovulation,
Hmm.
which biologically makes sense, right?
Yeah.
That is when we are supposed to be reproducing and having intercourse to make potential children
Hmm.
ultimately.
Hmm.
And so makes sense that that's when the female body is going to be most
Yep.
desiring sexual interaction.
Yep.
So with the testosterone pathway, you know there's so many different ways that testosterone is made within the body. There's not just like one way.
Hmm.
But when we have stress, and you could probably speak to this a little bit better because this is your area of expertise, but in it increases the cortisol production in the adrenal gland. Wow, I'm struggling here. In the adrenal glands.
Hmm.
And then that increases your insulin. It also increases your testosterone,
Hmm.
and that all can feed into hormonal imbalances and arousal changes and menstrual cycle issues as well, and irregularities.
Absolutely. And do you end up working with women that either tend towards a higher testosterone, which is what we'll see maybe in PCOS, versus, I mean, I see a lot, in perimenopause, obviously going towards the other end, which is that
Mhm.
lower testosterone time.
In the work that I do, so as a PA, I actually work in infertility, and I see lots of women
Mm,
who have elevated testosterone. I do
Mm-hmm.
lots of diagnosing of PCOS.
Mm-hmm.
But we also don't really talk too much about desire and sex.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I find really interesting is that although testosterone is very closely related with desire,
Mm-hmm.
for a lot of women who have increased testosterone above normal levels, they actually have less desire. Have you
Mm.
seen that as well?
Well, I do know it with PCOS for sure. It's definitely, you would think, oh, your testosterone's higher, but yeah, it's not there really. So, and I think that's a really good point because our bodies really do want, this each of the hormones to kind of be in this tight area essentially, not too much, yes, it fluctuates throughout the month, but within those fluctuations it kind of wants to stay in a certain space. And so when you get too much testosterone, it's going to be just as bad as too low testosterone.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. So let's go a little bit more into, I'm curious about this sort of desire component. If you aren't having as much intimacy or desire as either maybe you want to, or, you're at the point where you're like, I don't really care, but that you have a partner that wants that. Um, well, let's talk about the physical ways that we can support ourselves, but also is, the emotional components that play into this. And if you can sort of bring desire in, even if you don't have it
Yes.
currently.
Oh, this is one of my favorite topics. I love that you asked me
Yeah.
this. With desire and creating it, creating desire for yourself, I think one of the biggest things is cultivating intimacy with yourself. So if you're partnered or alone, it doesn't really matter,
Hmm.
but you really need to focus on cultivating that intimacy with yourself, loving yourself, um, and just caring for your body. One
Hmm.
thing that I found a lot with my clients is that the more you talk about sex, the more interested in sex you are.
Hmm.
So, having more conversations, maybe doing more reading of erotica, just thinking about sexual fantasies and thinking
Hmm.
about sex more is going to get you more aroused
Hmm.
to have more desire to do sex
Hmm.
and be intimate with your partner.
Hmm.
So I think that's one of the big things. Some of my other favorite tips would be like lingerie. Wearing lingerie is going
Hmm.
to help you feel sexy. For a lot of people, if you don't feel good in your body, you're just not interested in having sex either. And
Right.
so making sure that you are able to start again loving on your body, saying nice things to your body, but feeling good in the body that you have right now. So
Hmm.
lingerie is a really great way for that. And lingerie doesn't have to look like a little tiny lace thing that you picked
Right.
up at Fredericks in Hollywood or whatever place you go
Right.
to.
That still exists. Yeah.
I know, right? Are there even any stores? I'm so disconnected from the world of shopping, but
Right.
it could be like silky lingerie or just something that you feel sexy in.
Right.
And sometimes I think that we make it more complicated than it needs to be, and that it needs to be this elaborate thing that we do, but it really doesn't. It really doesn't.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. And I think, the point to the lingerie, I love it because I think there are so many more options with lingerie these days for differently sized bodies that make you really look good too, and make you feel good in your body. And so that's, a beautiful thing. I think that's not too hard to find, or, if you seek it out.
Yeah.
And yeah, yeah.
All the different shapes. I mean, if say your midsection is an area that you're more self-conscious about,
Mm-hmm.
maybe try baby dolls. Those
Mm-hmm.
cover up the
Mm-hmm.
midsection very well. And so you can find a different style that enhances the areas that you feel really good about and then maybe covers the areas that you're not feeling so confident about as well.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other tips and tricks that you find work really well with your patients?
Well, honestly, meditation.
Mm.
And I know that you talk about this a lot
Mhm.
too, but meditation is, I think, one of the most underutilized tools. And that when you slow down to pay attention to all of the sensations and everything that you are feeling and receiving, it is going to also help you be more present in your sexual
Mm.
connections.
Mhm.
And that can help as well with being intimate.
Yeah.
The other thing that is kind of coming to mind too, I totally lost it there for a second, is for women, our brain is
Mm-hmm.
really important.
Mm-hmm.
And so stimulating our brain, getting our brain involved, creating whatever type of connection you need. So maybe being intimate with your partner isn't having sex with your partner and penetrative sex. Maybe that looks like having more time to just cuddle and
Mm-hmm.
share and be close to each other, hold hands, take showers together, bathe together, go on maybe a long weekend together, whatever that looks like, but cultivating intimacy between each other rather than just having sex.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Because, in our patriarchal society, we think of intimacy as just sex, usually, right? That's
Yes.
what leads it. When the reality is intimacy is something much deeper and much more profound and, builds over time and all of these things, all the stuff that you just mentioned.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
when you cultivate the intimacy, the sex will come.
Yeah, exactly, and it'll be better most of the time, I'm not gonna say 100% across the
Absolutely.
board, but in general, go
Yeah,
ahead.
you're just
Yeah,
going to feel so much more connected with your partner.
yeah,
And that will a lot of times increase the pleasure that you receive from the actual act of sex.
right. So I have a question. Do you ever see hormone shifts happen when people sort of draw more desire into them?
So I haven't studied hormones, so I
Mhm.
don't actually know, but
Gotcha.
I feel like from a scientific standpoint, that would
Mhm.
actually make sense,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And hmm, that sounds very interesting and like a really great study. Have you done any
You
research on
know,
that?
I've read a little bit about that happening, and I think about it similarly to just specifically if we're talking about testosterone, we know weight training, that's more studied, that actually does lift our testosterone. That's one of the best ways to just naturally lift testosterone if you have low testosterone. So to me, it makes sense that not just testosterone really, because we know that estrogen and progesterone are also important in desire, which women will notice when they start losing their estrogen in particular, but also with the progesterone, and that they'll notice that desire creep back up when, if they use bioidentical hormone replacement therapy. Again, testosterone, they're going to notice the biggest impact, but estrogen and progesterone do play that role too. And so, yeah, I imagine, and I'm actually going to do a little more research after we get off today because I'm super curious that it is, a physiological response essentially to
Mhm.
you're kind of, again, going back to the stress response, right? We think about how stress goes through our brain and that impacts our adrenals and our ovaries, but also we can take our brain and flip it, right, with all kinds of things like meditation and mindset, and that impacts the physiological response too, right? So it makes perfect sense
Yeah,
that it would. Yeah.
it really does. I wanted to talk about estrogen a little bit more
Hmm.
because you brought up how the role that that plays. And I
Hmm.
think that one really important to think is one important thing when it comes to estrogen, especially in perimenopausal women, is that when that's decreased, that does lead to vaginal atrophy,
Yes.
decreased lubrication. And so
Yes.
sex can become more painful and uncomfortable, which
Hmm.
can also be a reason why you're not interested in having
Hmm.
sex.
Hmm.
And so that's something to be aware of. There are lubricants, bioidentical hormones. There are lots of different things that you can do. But I think also noting that that can play a role in all of it too.
Absolutely. I think that's hugely important, right? Because why are you going to have desire if it's painful, right? It's really going to be
Exactly.
hard to desire penetrative sex if it feels painful. And yeah, I'll just add on to that. I think, particularly, I mean, going on bioidentical hormone replacement therapy is a whole other very large topic, of course, but, there's still women that are fearful to do that for, valid reasons, breast cancer history in their family, et cetera, et cetera. But what you can get is, suppositories that contain estriol, which is the sort of least potent estrogen, right? It's actually considered a protective estrogen. and it's just localized. It's only going to impact, your vaginal tissues. It's not going to be systemic in your body. So you do have an option if you don't want to go on BHRT for, whatever reasons that you don't want to go on it, to actually still at least help relubricate, plump up the tissues in your vulva, which is very important, not just for sex, but I mean, I have a client, a post hysterectomy. I mean, it hurt for her to walk with underwear on, so things can get really intense when you don't have any lubrication in your vulva. So yeah, it's a
Yeah.
big deal.
The
Yeah.
dryness can be very, very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And I'm not familiar. I know there are some brands that make just a daily vaginal, not a lubricant, but more of like a refreshing moisturizer
Mm-hmm.
for the vulva and the
Mm-hmm.
vagina. And I think that that's something else too. If you are somebody who maybe has some dryness, it's uncomfortable and it's
Mm-hmm.
affecting your everyday work and
Mm-hmm.
everyday life, you can look into something like that too.
Yeah, absolutely. There are lots of options out there. I'm glad that we're starting to talk about them more, because I think that so much of the time women, just they were in the dark and there was no options
Mhm.
being put out there. So, you don't have to go full tilt, but you have some options along the way. Yeah, I think that's just so important. I want to circle back to one thing that to add on to the like bringing more desire into your life and loving on yourself. I was a dance instructor for many years. Yeah, and I did a form that I created the name. It was called Jazzy Showgirl. So kind of like cabaret style, like we called it a hint of burlesque, so just kind of playing around with that area. And I loved teaching that class because I had women of all different ages and sizes, and I could just see them sink into their bodies, right? In a completely different way. First of all, save space for them to do that, and then that community feel of that experience too. And being able to dress up and do things like that too, and see themselves in the mirror, that it was so incredible, for me to be able to see that happen for them. And I got many notes from them over the years of just how that's the first time they felt like they were truly in their bodies. And I think that's what's so key, right? Is like we have to feel in our bodies to sort of understand desire.
Yeah, I love that you brought that up too, because I have a pole in my living room
Hmm.
and I
Nice.
do like self seduction.
Yeah.
That's really important. Like,
Yep.
seduce yourself. Don't
Yep.
depend on your partner, but how can you feel good in your body? I think that's one of the biggest things. And see yourself from a sexy lens. I
Hmm.
go to twerk class. Like,
Nice.
yes, I am a full supporter of all kinds of fun dance and sexy dance.
Yeah, yeah, so good, and I think that not obviously not everyone is going to be comfortable with dancing, but I think I always tell women just try it. Just go and try it, or try it in your living room or in your bedroom. There's plenty of YouTube videos out there. You don't have
There
to go
are.
out the door to do it, and just see how you feel afterwards, because I think a lot of times people will be amazed, at how much that they like feel connected and different about their bodies afterwards, and really start to love their bodies on a different level. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that recommendation.
So let's talk a little bit about maybe, you know, as we're tracking our cycle, if we're doing that, we've talked a little bit about desire popping up more around ovulation, but how can you kind of work with your cycle to increase your desire?
Yes. So, in each part of your menstrual cycle, you can kind of tailor your dating and your foreplay and your romance to be optimized around that cycle.
Mm,
So, if you're familiar with cycle syncing, it's very similar to that.
mhm,
It is that, but
mhm,
based on sex and desire rather than
mm.
diet and exercise
Okay.
and work schedule. So,
Nice.
I have a really wonderful resource here for the listeners that are watching on YouTube. You'll see
Hmm.
In the Flow from
Hmm.
Elisa Veet. Have you read this book before?
I haven't read that one of hers, but I've read, I definitely follow her. Yeah.
Yes. So I'm just going to kind of pull this up for reference here. But in your follicular phase, novelty is really good.
Mm,
So looking at say, doing something new, trying something new in the bedroom, doing something more adventurous in your relationship, that would be a really good time for that. In your ovulatory phase, so that's when you have your most energy a lot of times, your most desire. So being able to do more activities of receiving and talking more about like your sexual fantasies and having multiple orgasms during this phase. In your luteal phase, one thing I'd like to point out here too is that it's normal to have a little bit of decreased vaginal secretions. And so, especially in the late luteal phase, that means that you might want to use a lubricant during this phase, especially. Although, I'll be honest, majority of women enjoy sex with a lubricant all of the time. But definitely being mindful of there are different phases of your menstrual cycle based on your hormones where you just don't produce enough vaginal secretions, and it can make it more uncomfortable and make you not want to have sex.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in the luteal phase, maybe for me, that's when it's a little bit rougher for me. So I would prefer to do more like intimate connection things, like cooking together, or maybe like a gentle walk together, or even like increased foreplay, especially in that second half of your luteal phase, because you know that you're going to need a little bit more to be aroused. It's normal to have a little bit harder time orgasming as well in the luteal phase. And then in the menstrual phase, you have your bleeding. So that is going to produce a little bit of additional lubricant. However, if you get a cut, blood dries pretty fast. So it doesn't necessarily sustain lubrication over time. And so this would be a really good time for just connecting with your partner yet again. So I think you got your do something adventurous and then have lots of fun and then kind of take it a little bit easy.
Yeah. And that totally follows, the other sort of approaches in your life that it can be useful around cycle syncing. So yeah, I love that. So I just want to mention really quick, it's funny about, having penetrative sex on your period. I think for you, maybe when you're younger, and I'm just maybe speaking for personal experience and like my age group, right? Like that was just the thought of that was like, no, I don't want to, and then you finally did. And you're like, oh my God, for me, it was like, oh my God, this is amazing because of that extra lubrication, right?
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and all of the hormones that are released, especially
Yeah.
when you have like your oxytocin release that
Right.
causes uterine contractions and all of those things that are released, your endorphins that are like natural painkillers that helps with cramping. So,
Mm-hmm.
yes, like that for a lot of people does feel really good
Right.
when you or if you choose to embrace period sex.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm like, there's something kind of primal about it too, to me, like you're just
Yeah.
like, you're like the blood. I love it. That's just
One
me.
thing I love that. One thing I would add to that too is that there is something called menstrual cups,
Mm-hmm.
or I'm sorry, menstrual discs. Are you
Mm-hmm.
familiar with the
Yep.
discs?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yep.
you can have mess-free period
Yeah.
sex with the disc in.
Yeah.
And it's not 100%, let's just be honest. Like
Right.
there is still going to be a little bit of
A little
blood,
bit around. Yeah.
but it's very well controlled.
Yeah.
And one way, like if you still want to explore with that, but you're really not fond of the idea of maybe seeing a lot of blood, you can do
Mm-hmm.
that. Or in the shower is another really great
Mm.
place
Mm-hmm.
for period sex.
That makes sense. Yeah. I hadn't really thought about that. So let's continue on the lubrication talk, because I think there's a lot of options out there with lubrication. So do you have recommendations on any particular lubrication that you like? And, at least
Yes.
bases to look for, that kind of thing.
Yes. So I did a whole podcast episode about
Mm.
different things to avoid when it comes to looking for a lubricant. There are a lot of chemicals in the majority of the brands that you see on the shelf at Target and CVS.
Mm-hmm.
They have things, you have estrogen, like phytoestrogens in them.
Yeah.
You have, just really harmful chemicals for our bodies.
Yeah.
So definitely being mindful when choosing a lubricant. One of my personal favorites is Pure Romance, Just Like Me. I've
Mm.
always really enjoyed theirs. It re-wets with your own natural secretions. So
Oh,
as
cool.
you become more turned on, it also re-wets.
Oh, that's
The
cool.
um, Uber Lube is a great silicone
Okay.
lubricant as well. Um, but silicone is going to be really great for somebody who doesn't have a lot of vaginal secretions and are experiencing a lot of vaginal dryness. That is definitely a go-to for
Mm,
that situation.
mhm,
Also, marathon sex, a really long sex,
mhm.
anything lasting more than 5 minutes. That's what I used to always say. Um, but you're like every day, find a good water base that's pH balanced.
Okay. And what are your thoughts on, I know some people like to use coconut oil, just straight up. What do you think about that?
Not a fan.
Okay.
And the reason for that is that it's an oil and that it can harbor bacteria.
Mm,
And if even though yes, you cook with it and you eat it and it is natural and it is healthy, when
mhm,
it comes to our vulvas and our vaginas, they are very sensitive for a lot of people. And
mhm,
that can throw off your pH, can potentially result in vaginitis, so bacterial
mhm,
vaginosis or a yeast infection.
mhm,
It also kind of depends on how sensitive you are, because some
mhm.
people maybe be just fine with that.
Right.
Personally, I wouldn't use it.
Yeah. Good to know, because I think that's a go-to for a lot of people that, consider themselves natural. They're like, I have it, it's easy. So I
Mhm.
was, yeah, very curious about your thoughts. What about with utilizing condoms? Are any of these off the
Yes.
grid because you're
No.
using condoms?
Yes, and
Yeah.
I love that you asked that. No oils with
Mhm.
condoms.
Mhm.
That will break them down.
Mhm.
And then pay attention. So there's different types of condoms out there now.
Mhm.
You have there's like two or three different types of main materials. A lot of them are safe with most lubricants,
Mhm.
but there are some interactions. And if you are ever worried, just stick with a water-based
Mhm.
lubricant. That is
Mhm.
going to be your best bet.
Okay. Good to know. Thinking about other like aspects of desire, when a person is kind of at that point where they're just like, I don't want to do this at all. I don't know if you ever have any patients coming to you. And do you encourage them to try and regain it, or in some situations is that just like okay that they don't want to go there anymore?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of components to explore with this, and
Mhm.
that yes, it is okay to not want to go there anymore.
Mm,
First of
mhm.
all,
Mhm.
there is also a term called asexual.
Mm, mhm.
And for a lot of people, we are in this world where we have societal expectations and what we're supposed to do. And for a lot of people, you may not know that you are actually asexual until later
Mm,
on in life,
interesting.
because over time you've always just had sex because that's what you're supposed to do,
Right.
right? But then eventually you're like, wait, I don't necessarily want this.
Yeah.
And so there is that to always be explored as well, and that there
Mhm.
are a lot of individuals who are asexual, and there's a growing community. I did a podcast about that, so that's one thing I like to point out, is that that may be absolutely normal
Mhm.
for you.
Mhm. Mhm.
Now, if you're like, I don't want to have sex, but I would like to regain that, I think definitely exploring a little bit deeper
Mhm.
as to, okay, what can we do to regain that
Right.
desire?
Right. And it can be emotional, it can be old trauma coming up, it can be hormone changes. There's all of these different reasons. And
Yes.
often they kind of gel together at the same time, right? So it
Yep.
may take a little getting that onion layer by layer and to figure it out.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and there can be thyroid issues,
Yeah.
anemia. There
Yeah.
are so many medical conditions that could actually be contributing.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, in our Western medicine community, those are not necessarily things that are looked at.
Right.
If you come in and say, like, oh, I have desire issues,
Yeah.
most people are not going to look at that. And so, working with more functional medicine
Mhm.
type communities are probably going to explore that route a little bit
Underst
more.
Yeah, I understand that. But thank you for bringing up the asexual, aspect too, because I do think that that is important and something, again, that probably wasn't talked about much 20 years ago, much less before
Yeah.
that. And now, allowing that that is a reality for people allows people to, sit with that and determine if that's where they're at. Yeah. So thank you. Um, one other thing I wanted to talk about, I think is really just for me so mind blowing that we don't have every woman after giving birth or having any kind of abdominal surgery is to do pelvic floor physical therapy.
Mhm.
So can we talk about how that plays into desire and intimacy too?
I would love to. I
Yeah.
am a huge fan of pelvic floor physical therapy. I actually went to an appointment a couple months ago for learning about what they
Mm,
do in there so that I could talk about it better.
cool.
And when you are having, like, so especially after birth, let's use that as an example, there's a lot of vaginal trauma that can happen after
Hmm.
birth.
Hmm.
And I see this a lot too for even women who have C sections, who didn't try to labor. They have still changes within
Hmm.
their genitals that make sex maybe less interesting or
Hmm.
more painful. So,
Hmm.
with pelvic floor physical therapy, they are really helpful for reducing tension. And if you have like too tight of muscles, so
Yeah.
maybe you had a tear when you delivered and they sutured you back up, but now it's too tight. And so that
Mm,
makes it really painful to have sex. Or, if maybe your vaginal tone is not tight enough, they can train you on how to increase the pelvic tone and increase the strength. And so that all plays in as well. If your pelvic floor is really tight, and the reason why I talk about tightness so much is because that's my experience, but
mhm.
then also I think so many of us have pelvic floor tightness and don't know it
Yep.
because we're taught do Kegels, do Kegels, do Kegels.
Yes.
The
Yep.
tighter the better, but actually that is not true.
Yes.
And so with a tight pelvic floor, when it comes to sex, your body is going to have a harder time orgasming because you have to have more tension on the muscles to induce an orgasm.
Mm,
And
mhm.
so it can be more difficult and harder to
Mm,
get to that level of orgasm. And so there is so much that pelvic floor can do with your desire and
mhm.
orgasm quality and
Mm.
frequency and pain with
Yeah.
sex.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I so 100% agree with you. I ended up having, I decided to go to pelvic floor physical therapy. I was lucky enough to be able to decide to go after all of my surgeries, but to help rebuild my abdominal wall, right? Because I'd had the multiple surgeries and you're just so apt to hernias after that. And I was like, I don't want to do it. I want to safely rebuild my abdominal wall. And probably a lot of people don't realize that's something that you can do with a pelvic floor physical therapist, but also at the same time, she was also, checking me vaginally. And that was when I learned, like, I literally had no idea that the left side was just super tight all the time. Right. And of course, I really just experienced it when she did her initial assessment and I could feel it, right? But it's like when there's nothing in there, I'm not necessarily feeling that. And even with sex, I didn't necessarily feel that. And so it was fascinating to me because she told me exactly what you said about, we're so um like on this train of, oh, do Kegels, do Kegels, do Kegels, stay tight, when the majority of women are actually need to do the opposite. And she taught me how to do essentially an opposite Kegel, right? It's like this like releasing motion rather than this pulling in motion. And it was just mind blowing to me, right? It's like there's so much that we don't even know is going on down there at any given time, much less after you've given birth and everything too. And it can be such an incredibly healing experience um, on an emotional level as well as a physical level. So, big
Yes.
fan.
I love that. Well,
Yeah.
and breath work is also really important. So, what she taught me, and I didn't realize the correlation, but when you take a deep breath, your diaphragm goes down. That
Hmm.
pushing down pushes your pelvic floor down, which then lengthens your pelvic floor muscles.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so, doing breath work, doing deep breathing can also be really helpful for your pelvic floor as
Hmm.
well.
Hmm. It's so incredible. Like, it's so amazing. Even as you were talking, I was like,
I know it's
releasing
hard
it down.
though.
Yeah. Yeah. And another thing, I mean, this doesn't have to do with the topic at hand, but one of the things my pelvic floor physical therapist let me know was that so many women in particular will end up in nursing homes primarily because they can't, hold either their urine or their feces, and pelvic floor physical therapy can help with that. It can retrain the muscles to be able to hold those things properly, and so I mean, that's just to me, that's so empowering and so life-giving to be able to do that. So I'm like I said, I think it should be like on the list after all of these different things that happen
100%.
in women's lives. Well, this has been an incredible conversation. I just love chatting with you about all of this. Let people know how they can contact you.
Yes, you can find me on Instagram. That is where I'm most active at Jordan Dennell,
Mhm.
JORDANDNELLE. You can also check out my website at jordandennell.com. And then my podcast, Vaginas, Vulvas, and Vibrators. Anywhere you listen to podcasts, it is there.
Nice. And do you work with people one-on-one or do you do
I
group stuff?
do.
Okay.
Yep. I
Mhm.
do one-on-one. I do
Mhm.
group. I do in-person things too.
Okay.
So I do a lot of a variety.
You cover the gamut. I love it. Well, I love that we've been able to have this conversation today. So thank you so much for being here.
Yes. Thank you so much for having
Yay.
me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Okay, you guys, I will see you next week.